who have joined the 5th webinar in our series of webinars launching KAICIID short films, highlighting the role of religious actors in global development agenda. Thank you for joining us. And my name is Anya Pishkur, and I am a program manager for Peace Mapping program at KAICIID, as well as a project manager of Faith4SDGs project. Kindly note that the webinar will be recorded and published on KAICIID website. So if you need to leave in the meantime, or you want to rewatch it, you are most welcome to do so. At the end of the webinar, we will post a very short evaluation form in a chat. So we kindly invite you to take a minute. It is just a minute to fill that out so we can continue to provide you with the relevant content. And before I move to introduce our speakers, I would like to invite you to introduce yourself as well in a chat. For example, stating your name, where you're from which community you're coming from, for which organization you are working. Because with us, we have Ms. Asha Ramgobin. She's a founder and current executive director of Human Rights Development Initiative from South Africa. And Mr. Basim Dudin, he's an area development program manager at Palestinian National Economic Empowerment Institute from Palestine. He was supposed to join us. Let's hope that we didn't get confused with the different time zones and time changes. However, let's start with the video that we at KAICIID filmed for Global Goal 8 for removing barriers to employment. We filmed with Islamic Development Bank and UNDP Invest Bank Palestine.
أنا أرى أن العمل الخيري والتمكين الاقتصادي أصبح حاجة ملحة للمجتمعات، خصوصا في ظل الأوضاع العصيبة التي تعانيها المجتمعات بشكل عام، وبالذات المجتمع الفلسطيني. فأنا أرى أن البعد الديني يجب أن يكون حافزا ومشجعا على مواصلة مشوار العمل الخيري للإنسان كإنسان، وهذا الإنسان يخدم لأنه إنسان.
فصار في قفزة هائلة المنحنى بخصوص نسب البطالة ونسب الفقر متصاعد، وهذا تحدي كبير يواجه الشباب الفلسطيني، ولهذا وجد برنامج التمكين الاقتصادي للشعب الفلسطيني، والذي تحول لاحقا إلى المؤسسة الوطنية الفلسطينية.
بلشت بهذا الشغل بال2012، كانت شغلة كلها عن طريق الصدفة. هي ورق كتير كانت عندي في البيت، حاولت إني أستغلها وأعمل منها ألعاب لأطفالي وهيك، وبلش معي إنه يصير مشروع الناس حبته. شاركت بمعارض كتيرة. الفكرة كتير حلوة، كتير بسيطة، إنك أنت من ولا إشي عم تعملي كل إشي.
تحديات والله بالاول انه اهل البلد رفضوا فكره اول شيء انه يعني بنت انه اللي تدير مشروع زي هيك وهي اللي تشتغل، وكانوا يعني بصراحه يعني في منهم يخجلوا انه اصلا يجوا عندي على المحل، لانه بتعرفي كيف احنا قريه بلده يعني، بس انه مش كثير منفتحين. صاروا يعني اول شيء بالاول ما حدا يعني انه كشباب او شيء زي هيك يجوا يوصوا، بس فئه نسوان بنات يعني اشياء زي هيك، بس مع شوي شوي يعني مع الوقت ولما انا تجوزت
What we've seen under the DEEP program is that female entrepreneurs encounter very specific problems when they try to start a business or to grow their business. And so the DEEP program has been very constructive in helping them overcome these issues, such as lack of support from the community, or sometimes envy or jealousy from family members, sometimes difficulty with access to funding. And this is where the DEEP program has not only encouraged them and supported them to grow, but also to become role models in their community, supporting other women, really helping them along. In the state of Palestine, UNDP's role is very much one of encouraging economic empowerment and of support to the Palestinian Authority. And so in this close collaboration with the Islamic Development Bank, we've been able to focus on Goal 8 of the SDGs very much to ensure that people have access to decent work.
لوحدها دون التعاون. لذلك أنا أتمنى أن يكون، وأنا أؤمن أن يكون هنالك تعاون بين المؤسسة الحكومية والمؤسسة الأهلية. المؤسسة الحكومية لديها إمكانيات عالية وقوية من حيث المعلومات ومن حيث الإمكانيات ومن حيث الأبنية والمنشآت الحكومية. كذلك المؤسسات الخيرية لديها القدرة على تنمية وتطوير قدرات الشباب، وأن تقوم بإحضار مشاريع لهؤلاء الشباب من خلال المؤسسات الخيرية التي تتعامل معها هذه الجمعيات.
احنا ما عندنا أي تحفظ على التعامل مع أي مؤسسة لها أي بعد ديني على الإطلاق. احنا بنعتبر كل المؤسسات هي شريكة في التنمية الاقتصادية والاجتماعية، ونعتبرها أنه هي جزء من التنمية المستدامة، ولذلك احنا نتعاون بانفتاح مع كل المؤسسات التنمية الإسلامية والإغاثة الإسلامية وغير ذلك، مع جمعية الشابات المسيحيات، مع كل الجمعيات أيضا المسيحية والإسلامية.
إذن يعني أنا باعتقادي، وأنا شخصيا من الأكثر الناس معجبين في برنامج تمكين العائلات الفلسطينية الفقيرة، وبعتبر أنه هو من أنجح البرامج. أنا اشتغلت بفوق 30 سنة في هذا المجال. يعني أنا بعتقد أنه في هناك فرادة في المجتمع الفلسطيني حقيقة، يعني بتميز فيها المجتمع الفلسطيني في العلاقات الطائفية والدينية، في العلاقات الاجتماعية. وبعتقد النضال الوطني خلق مجموعة من القيم والمفاهيم اللي بتقفز فوق الطائفية الضيقة وفوق حتى العشائرية وفوق الواقع الجغرافي.
صرت هلا كل إشي، يعني قديش أنا قدمت للورق وقديش هو قدم لي، فهذا الإشي أعطاني دافع كتير قوي إني أنا أشتغل على حالي أكتر، أطور على نفسي أكتر، أفيد غيري أكتر. مثلا إنه صار في صبايا عم تشتغل معي. غير هيك إنه أنت كيف تستقبلي مشاكلك، كيف تستقبلي طموحاتك، كيف تطلعي لأحلامك، كيف تحققيها. فهذا الإشي كله ساعدني من خلال هاي الأوراق، الإشي البسيط يعني.
Empowering women in the economy and closing gender gaps in the world of work are key to achieving the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly Goal 5 to achieve gender equality and Goal 8 to promote full and productive employment and decent work for all. Gender differences in laws affect both developing and developed economies and women in all regions. Globally, over 2.7 billion women are legally restricted from having the same choice of jobs as men. Of 189 economies assessed in 2018, 104 economies still have laws preventing women from working in specific jobs. 95 economies have no laws on sexual harassment in the workplace, and in 18 economies, husbands can legally prevent their wives from working. Too often, we discriminatory social norms constrain women's ability to find decent jobs on equal footing with the men. Layers of disadvantage, including those related to poverty, ethnicity, disability, age, geography, and migration status, remain powerful obstacles to equal rights and opportunities for hundreds of millions of women. Women also very often face lack of access to financial services. They're unable to save, borrow, or build capital. Many women-owned businesses lack access to credit. So, Ms. Ramgobin, how can faith-based organizations, many of which have access to or can mobilize immense financial resources, how they can fill the gap?
Well, before I answer that question, Anya, I just want to congratulate KAICIID on a very, very inspirational video, I have to say. It just goes to show that charity is not only about providing meals and just providing food to people, providing cash, but it's also really about skills, and for it to be sustainable, it needs to really be creative. And I think what you showed was a really creative intervention. But, you know, again, before answering your question, one of the thoughts that crossed my mind when I was watching the video is just to emphasize the point that SDG 8 talks about decent work. And I think we need to just be clear about what's the difference between just creating work and jobs, and creating jobs and actually creating decent work. And I think for that, we should look at the ILO, the International Labour Organization, and look at what they mean by decent work. So this is work that's productive. So we're talking about, you know, where you actually do something that leads to something else. It's not, you know, that a particular activity for the sake of that activity that doesn't lead to something. So if you're baking a cake, as the lady was, you're baking a cake and that cake is going to be sold. So you're actually producing something that is needed. Whereas if, for instance, you're producing some sort of product that's not needed, that has no market, you know, it makes no sense. So decent work needs to be productive. It needs to have fair income. So you need to have a fair income, not just some income, not necessarily the minimum wage, but it needs to be fair within the whole context, right? There needs to be security, both in the workplace and security in the job itself. So in the COVID context, it's really important because here, decent work within the COVID context means having all the protective equipment if you have to go into work, for example, that you have to have sanitization, you have to have your temperature being checked, you have to work with sufficient distance between you and things like that. But it doesn't stop there. You know, decent work and the goal that we're looking at trying to achieve under the Sustainable Development Goals don't end there. It goes beyond that to include things like social protection for the family of the worker. It includes the freedom of the worker to express themselves and their concerns about their working environment, to organize and participate in decisions that affect them. So for example, if the employer decides, now we can't work from the premises, so people are going to work from home, but your working hours are basically you have to be available 24/7. And it doesn't matter that you have a family. It doesn't matter that if your employer contacts you, you have to be available regardless. That would not constitute decent work. It would not be respectful of these provisions, because you would need to be able to articulate yourself, you would need to be able to argue, and you would need to be able to say, protect your right to particular working hours. And finally, the last element, which goes directly to what we're talking about today as well, is equal opportunity, equality of opportunity and treatment for men and women. So I just wanted to highlight that decent work, the agenda is not just, and the goal is not about just work, it's qualified, it's decent work, and this is what decent work entails. And us in the developing world, in the developing context, now coming to your question about women in the developing context, in the developing world, you have a circumstance where women do get opportunities to work and to earn some income. But if a person has to take public transport, 3 different taxis, 3 different forms of public transport to get to their workplace, and then work a full 8-hour day, and then only earn enough to buy maybe the meal that you need for that particular day, because all your income is being used for transportation, that does not constitute decent work. And most domestic workers, I really, when we think about women and poor women, it's the domestic workers that come to mind for me, particularly in Africa, who are probably the most exploited in the work environment here. So your question was about how do you include women in the economy in a more sustainable way, right? And I think some of the strategies that were described in the video are also strategies that have been used by the Grameen Bank. I'm not sure if your participants and you are familiar with this model, but it is a model where low-income women come together in like a cooperative, and that cooperative then receives a loan to undertake a small business enterprise. I mean, they've done things like buy chicken or buy, rear different sorts of animals, vegetable gardens, and many different types of small business enterprises. And so this bank only provides loans to women. It did anyway. I'm not sure about right now, but at its early stages, it did. And one of the ideas behind it is that when you support women, you're not just supporting that individual. You are investing in the children, you're investing in the family, and you're investing in the wider community that woman comes from. Because she is, the studies have shown this. This is not just me as a feminist or as a woman sort of putting forward this theory or this idea. Studies have actually shown that this kind of model works, and that this is, if you teach a woman something, it doesn't stay with her. If you invest even a small amount of money in this kind of project, and women are at the heart of it, it usually spreads. Doesn't always, I'm not going to say it's always like that, but substantially like that. So what would the role of faith communities be? I think with faith communities, often rich people satisfy their consciences by simply donating money or contributing. The idea of charity within faith-based communities is not always to change the fundamental structures in society that create the inequality and that create the poverty. Often in faith-based community settings, the approach is to just put a bandage on the wound. And you see a hungry person, you feed them. You see a naked person, you clothe them. But I think we are being called to do more than that, because the poverty that we're dealing with in the world right now is extreme. The inequality is extreme, and there are very deep structural reasons for it. So faith-based communities need to look at those problems of hungry people, naked people, feed and clothe, but to make sure that it's balanced with sufficient attention to the structural causes of that inequality.
Thank you. So you have, because you have mentioned the decent jobs includes many different aspects of creative and productive work environment, to fair income and security in terms of health and social security, as well as freedom of expression at the workplace. And you also mentioned the rights of an employee, and you have a background of a human rights law. So I wanted to maybe go a bit back and ask you if you can share a bit with us some of the gaps of the human rights for women. And what can we do to ensure their full inclusion in the society and in all aspects of society, not just for the economic empowerment?
So once again, Anya, I'm such an badly disciplined panelist. So I'm going. When you said let's go back, it brought up a story in my mind. So if you don't mind, I'd like to share that with you and our viewers, and then come back to this. So, you know, we were talking about productive work, that decent work entails productive work. About 15 or 20 years ago, when I ran a university-based law clinic and provided free legal services to people who couldn't afford private lawyers, one of the aspects of our work was to provide legal advice and support to people running very small, more at the level in terms of official definitions of micro enterprise, because small business is actually quite big in terms of official definitions. So it's really supporting micro level business, right? And here was this lady who was given a loan to set up a dry cleaning office, like a laundromat in a very low income township. What chance did she have of succeeding? Because how many low income people are going to actually take their washing and give it to somebody else to do? If they can afford to do that, they wouldn't be living in that circumstance that they're living in. So needless to say, her business did not succeed at all. And she couldn't service the loan. She couldn't pay the interest back on the loan. She had all this equipment and everything, but she couldn't do anything with it. And we came into their lives at a time when this organization that provided them with the loan, it was a government development agency that was established under apartheid days, but now we come into their lives during the post-apartheid period in 96, 97. So it's about 2 years into Nelson Mandela's presidency. So what we did was we negotiated on her behalf and said to the organization that was trying to get the money back and basically kick her out, evict her from these premises. We said to them, when you gave her this loan, you didn't do a proper feasibility study of this kind of business. You know, there's no way this sort of business was going to succeed there. Give her a chance to establish a different kind of business, and then let's see what happens. So do you know, at the end of this whole process, what they did was they contracted her services to renovate and clean up those premises, right? Because it was not in good shape. You know, there were puddles of water and it was dirty and a lot of pollution and everything. So they paid her for that, which generated income. But she was so creative, given this opportunity. She was then so creative that what she did was she set up like a makeshift movie house. So it wasn't really it was just benches, right? Just very rudimentary benches that she put in a row. Somebody made hot dogs and sold them there. And the target audience were kids that came back from school whose parents were still at work, And these kids then could actually just come here, watch a movie, a kid's movie, with a video and a television. It wasn't some big fancy equipment or anything like that. And she generated income, and she became a really successful entrepreneur that was written about in the business newspapers about 6 or 7 months later. You know, so when I say you give a woman an opportunity and you invest in her, it's going to have a ripple effect in the whole community. She was aware that other women who are going out to work as domestic workers or whatever, small, you know, not wealthy ladies at all, right? But they needed someone to help them with childcare. And this then becomes a double up sort of strategy to help with childcare and to generate some income, because she saw, I think she charged under $1 for this, you know, for a hot dog and the movie. And she generated sufficient income in the evenings. On a weekend, in the evenings, the grown-ups would come and she would then charge them a little more and all of that. But she became, as I said, a successful businesswoman, you know, who also met needs of the community and other women that then were also able to fulfill their work obligations and requirements. So you see the ripple effect, you know. And this is the thing, it's to be creative, it's to listen, you know, to not just go and impose what you think is the solution, but to listen to what the community that you are trying to help, to listen to what they actually need and listen to their ideas and then help them from there, you know, to kind of give them advice where you can, but to really make this a partnership rather than us as the saviors coming to, you know, and that is something that can happen quite a lot with faith-based organizations, and that where the wealthy people in faith communities think that they're going like saviors to the poor people to kind of save them from this poverty. Whereas if we actually listen to the people and respect their dignity, we putting our faith into practice too, you know, in a deeper level, and actually addressing some of the root causes of problems, not just at the surface level of things. So.
Yeah, especially now, I think during the pandemic, when a lot of like billions of workers are facing, are risking that they're gonna lose their jobs. I think even especially now, it's important is we become more creative in terms of the solutions to how to provide people with an opportunity to start maybe something new, because their old businesses are, and I guess we're gonna face that for some time also after the pandemic. So maybe like the listening part and reaching out into communities where what is needed, it's the most important thing to recover from the recession that we are facing at the moment.
Yes. If I can just pick up on this point of the recovering from the recession, and particularly looking at the stimulus packages and the way in which governments are trying to help kind of inject new life into the economy. I was having a conversation literally just before we came onto this webinar with somebody who was looking exactly at this issue and being very critical about the South African government's social grant. There's a specific grant that has been given to poor people just to enable them to at least put food on the table. And the question that arises is the extent to which such packages can be abused. And no doubt such packages can be abused. But what often happens, and I think this is something we really need to reflect very deeply on, what often happens in society, and faith-based communities are not immune to this, is when we provide charity, right? And we provide help. And then you see that the poor person, for example, there was a study done by the previous winners of the Nobel Prize for Economics, Banerjee and Duflo, these economists from Berkeley University, I think, where they were describing the situation where aid organizations would contribute mosquito nets to a particular community. And the idea is this is going to help cut down on malaria, deal with malaria, right? They would go back and realize that the mosquito nets are being used as fishing nets, right? And then the question, what happens? What is your response to that circumstance? This is what I think is very important. How do we respond to that? There was a time when I would be quite aghast at it. I would be very, here we investing all this time, this effort, this money, collecting a lot of resources, buying hundreds of thousands of mosquito nets, and you go back to see what your investment has actually, what fruit it's borne, and it's a fishing net. And the malaria rate still is going up. That's because malaria in many countries in Africa, in Sierra Leone, for example, where I worked for a little while, people actually live with malaria in a way that we lived with the flu, not the COVID virus, but with a very serious flu, burning temperatures and all of that, but they're there at work and continuing with what they need to do, right? But they need to earn a living. And so they use the nets to fish so that they can then make money, feed their families, support the communities, and continue. So how do we respond to that? Do we then just say that this is corruption, this is abuse, this is, brand it, judge it in a way where we are actually taught by our faith traditions not to? We are taught not to judge, not to throw the stone, to give people the benefit of the doubt and to try to understand why they might be doing certain things. What we do and what aid organizations and economists generally would do, I say generally because these economists took a completely different approach to all of these issues. What they do is basically then conclude that aid, there was a person who wrote a book called Dead Aid, basically that aid perpetuates dependency, aid is abused by the elite, aid is, all these different arguments to say that poor people don't really deserve this kind of help, that they are in their situation because of their own choices and everything. Whereas if we actually take the time to listen, as I said earlier on, to listen and to plan more carefully. So before going and giving out mosquito nets, asking people what will help them. And then starting from there, it takes longer, it takes more effort, it takes more energy, it's more frustrating, and it can be quite depressing as well. But it's necessary if we want to see that our resources, our time, and if we really want to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals of dealing with inequality.
Of the Sustainable Development Goals of inequality and also reducing poverty and inclusive economic growth, where do you see that faith-based organizations can come together or contribute to remove those barriers to achieve that in the African continent?
Mm-hmm. So we first have to ask ourselves, what are these barriers, right? And in Africa, growth was increasing. We had growth rates that were going on the upward trajectory. We are endowed with resources, substantial resources. We have a very young workforce. We have a lot going for us in Africa. But at the same time, you asked how can faith-based organizations come together to address barriers? My emphasis is on barriers. What are these barriers? And what we have learned in the last years is that Africa loses more money through illicit financial flows, which illicit financial flows includes tax evasion, tax avoidance, profit shifting. Africa loses more money through illicit financial flows than it receives in aid, loans, and investment combined. And on top of that, we think that the main way in which we lose money is through corruption, that's the largest proportion and the largest, so if you had to say what percentage of your money is being lost through corruption and what percentage through these other forms of commercial activity, tax evasion, tax avoidance, and profit shifting. The percentage that economists have provided us is that between 3 to 5% is lost through corruption. Between 20 to 25% 30 to 35% is lost through money laundering and money laundering, human trafficking, arms trafficking, and criminal activities. The balance, 60 to 65%, is lost through this kind of commercial activity. So when we talk about the barriers, and we then think about how, where does this money end up? Most of it ends up in tax havens. We've seen in leaks like the Panama leaks, the Paradise Paper leaks, the FinCEN leaks recently, Mauritius, Angola leaks. We've seen proof of this, that trillions of untaxed US dollars are sitting not just of the African elite, but of multinationals that operate within Africa. Taxes that could have come into our coffers as revenue to fund the Sustainable Development Goals, but are currently sitting in tax havens. So what can faith-based organizations do? I think faith-based organizations have a very, very important and significant role in coming together to actually talk about how important it is to deal with the opacity in tax havens. It's not to just throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it's about transparency. The thing is, one of the most complex aspects of a tax haven is the secrecy. And if we deal with the secrecy and rather open up and be more transparent, which again is very much part of the faith-based ethos, right? So a religious leader has greater gravitas in talking to those that actually, and convincing those that actually keep tax havens going and defend that secrecy. If they were to actually articulate why it is so important that we address this issue, I think people will listen. And so faith-based leaders, not just the community, but faith-based leaders, I think we need to hear their voice more loudly in this particular field. We hear it with certain church organizations, and I know Norwegian Church Aid have developed a strategy to try to get more faith-based organizations involved on this, in this, but it's not as strong and as clear and loud as it could be, and convincing as it could be, because we need faith-based leaders from across the faith spectrum. So we need strong Muslim leaders, strong Christian leaders, and Jewish leaders, and all of them coming together to address this. Otherwise, the cycle of inequality that we're seeing, the deepening of inequality, the cycle of poverty is just going to continue. I wanted to also just talk a little bit about poverty, if you don't mind. You know, when we think of poverty, when I talk about the cycle of poverty, but let me, it looks like you have something to ask me, so I'll just wait for that point.
I just wanted to, because you mentioned the taxation system. So the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has published research on the gender biases with the taxation system. So
yes,
highlighting that women are hit the hardest in this area. So how is that, and what is your perspective on that?
Yeah. So taxation rules, from a gender perspective, taxation rules have been a very interesting area to study, and a very interesting, if you want to see discrimination, it mirrors. I mean, I think what we need to acknowledge is that the taxation systems in many countries mirrors the social system of the country. So it doesn't come out of nowhere. It actually does reflect. So if there's economic imbalances and inequality and discrimination against women, and it's rife and it's promoted, and there's no talk about it, then you will find a situation where the taxation system in that country is one where a joint filing of taxation for a household will be done, signed by only the husband, not the wife at all. That how do they classify it? That the property, so in Old English common law, all income earned by a married couple, all the income earned by the married couple, remember, emphasis on all, is considered the property of the husband. So this was the old common law of England, right? Old English common law, which they have changed obviously since then. But the question arises: the colonies, all the colonies that England had, of the British Empire, that inherited these kinds of taxation rules, that have not had the opportunity to actually reform those taxation rules. The question arises as to what is the situation in those countries now, and do these rules still persist? So taxation rules can be there to kind of either mirror or perpetuate economic imbalances and that. But on the other hand, you look at a country like Singapore. Singapore is a tax haven. So there's many aspects of Singapore that we can discuss. But one of the interesting features of Singapore's taxation system is that they provide a tax incentive to women who have studied and who have children. So they get a tax benefit and a bonus, which then encourages women to study, and it encourages women to have children. And it provides them with some kind of incentive, a financial incentive, to enable them to actually do both, which in the long run, you can only imagine the ripple effect of such a policy. So taxation rules can be used to proactively address inequalities. In Africa, one of the things that you see, and it's not just in Africa, it's across the world, because governments are unable, because of this illicit financial flows, it's not only Africa that's a victim of illicit financial flows. In fact, in terms of just the quantity of money, not relative to GDP, but just the amount that is lost, the countries of the North actually lose much more than African countries do, right? But relative to our GDP, it's off the charts for Africa. But because governments have such a hard time securing revenue from corporate taxation because of all these evasion, avoidance, and profit shifting practices. Their solution to ensuring that they have some form of revenue is to increase and expand indirect taxation, which is consumption taxes, such as value-added tax. And in Africa, 85% of the economy is informal, according to an ILO study. And the vast majority of people involved in the informal economy are women. Indirect taxation affects the informal economy drastically because they often don't have people to help them to even file VAT returns and get back VAT that they've paid, for example. So they basically net losers in that kind of circumstance. And so you would see in OECD countries, more than 30%, the vast majority of the revenue generated is from VAT. And you see a similar kind of trend starting in countries like South Africa, where previously corporate income tax was a big chunk of our revenue. Over time, that's reducing and VAT is increasing. Hence, you see this perpetuation of inequality and the growing inequality in South Africa. South Africa is it's the most unequal countries in the world, if I'm not mistaken. But you see this growing inequality, this growing gap between the rich and poor, perpetuating even now under COVID circumstance.
Going back to the COVID-19 and insecurity and inequality, that it's gonna become even more evident, I wanted to ask you, how can we effectively include or promote active labor market policies in terms of strengthening the link that it's necessary between the social protection and economic empowerment in fragile states or in any state affected greatly by COVID, and how faith-based organizations can engage with the government on that issue?
Okay. So I think I'm going to make maybe 3 points here. Firstly, before answering how, I will answer why. Why is it necessary to do this, right? And one of the reasons for why it's necessary is because many countries that have large numbers of poor people have a large number of people that are chronically poor. So poverty, often we think about rich and poor, but there are grades of poverty. The chronically poor are people who've lived in poverty for a long period of time, sometimes their entire life. And what they then pass on to their children is poverty. And it continues, that cycle continues. So government policies need to come in, and social protection and things like that need to come in to actually address that form of poverty, the chronic poverty. COVID has created a different form of poverty as well, where I think it's called transient poverty. Or transition, but there's a particular word to describe that form of poverty. It essentially is this, where you experience, or the family or the community experiences a specific crisis, a tsunami, an earthquake, COVID, unemployment, you retrenchment or something. So you experience a specific crisis, and then you are plunged into a circumstance of poverty for a period of time. But it doesn't necessarily have to last forever, because there are many other factors that are at play that enable you to come out of it. So the circumstance could be that people might already have education, skills, track record and that, and it's just a question of time before they're able to secure new employment or rebuild their house or, whatever, deal with the crisis circumstance. So what government needs to do and how governments need to think about it is they need to really think about the worst circumstance that they're dealing with, deal with the most difficult part first, in a sense, because that chronic poverty is just going to continue and expand because, population is not reducing. So when you're passing that level of poverty down, you're passing it down to a large number of people and young people. And so you then have this unemployment crisis and you have crime and a range of different consequences arising from there. So you talked about what do governments need to do? How do they need to do it? And how do faith-based organizations engage? I come to this point, and I think Pope Francis has emphasized this in his, COVID-related conversations around developing a new economy and the Fratelli Tutti, where all of us are, when we thinking about the economy and all these different notions of building back better and everything, if we think that we are building our own family home and that these are brothers and sisters, we are brothers and sisters working together to rebuild our family home, rather than, I am this very rich man or woman and I'm just trying to help some poor relative in the village and I will never see them again and they don't really, I give my little contribution and forget about them after that. My conscience is clear because I did something, but did I really help? Right. So I think faith-based organizations, I come back to this point that faith-based organizations, both here, it's not only the leaders, but it's also the community, the actual community of faith communities, that we need to be thinking not only about those traditional forms of charity, but addressing root causes, supporting programs that create decent work and that provide education and skills so that people can actually pull themselves up and we help each other pull all of us up. And then we acknowledge that, we can never be saved alone. We have to be saved together. Otherwise we will not, we're not going to enter the kingdom of heaven on our own at all, So these are the aspects. And I think if faith leaders then emphasize these dimensions of the common teaching of all different faith traditions, we might see a difference, and we have to be hopeful. As believers, I think being hopeful is a really important part of our faith as well. So even though the situation is bleak and dark, and even though the powers that are involved in maintaining this very, very unjust economic order are so entrenched, still we have to have faith, hope, and determination, perseverance, to actually, take it a step at a time and deal with the root causes and not let our, not just ease our consciences by just, making a small donation or a big donation and being done with it.
Thank you. It was a great 1 hour dialogue with you. I like how you identified some of the quite specific things that has to be addressed first before we just talk about empowering and providing opportunities, but that it's really important what kind of opportunities these are for the long run, and to deal with that we need to find a sustainable solution for causes like chronic poverty, even beyond the COVID-19 pandemic and after that. addressing root causes and having programs which will support decent work with also education and skill, like vocational trainings or whatever is needed in different communities. It's really important. That's where faith-based organizations can provide a lot of support, because they have the trust and they have the resources to mobilize communities in that direction. I'm really glad I had a chance to talk with you about that. We're going to publish this dialogue online if anyone missed it or had to leave earlier. If you have any final remark to add, you're very welcome. Otherwise, we will leave it at that.
I don't know if anyone is tracking the questions, but it seemed as though there were some questions or some comments that participants had that looked interesting. So maybe you want to bring those up before we close, finally.
Yeah, so one of the question was, or the comments was in regards to the conflict zones.
Yes, I noticed that there was something, I didn't read it fully, but can you just expand on that? What were they asking?
A second. So that women bring some specific capabilities and skills, and that studies shows that women deliver better if their skills are facilitated and given opportunity to work. I didn't understand.
I think what they're saying, I think they're supporting. So the one about the conflict zones is a very interesting one, because this person was talking about how in a conflict zone, a charitable organization might go and give people seeds to start a vegetable farm. But there's no point in starting a vegetable farm in a conflict zone. So the women might end up cooking the seeds and feeding their family. And that is a really good example of how if you're not sensitive to the needs and you just go out and you provide charity with what could, it's good intentions, right? It's really good intentions, but we need to have more than good intentions. We need to really respect the dignity of poor people and respect the fact that poor people actually understand their circumstance and have ideas of how to come out of their circumstance based on their understanding of their context, their understanding of their own skill and capacity and everything. And if we take the time, if we make the effort, and if we are clear about these things, if in our heart of hearts we actually believe this, which is what we need to do, then I think all these different initiatives that we undertake could have a lot more impact than they currently do. And I think the documentary that you showed proves that, where people really, at the beginning, there were youth that they thought they were going to come and buy those cakes. But in the end, it ended up being a group of women that came there and bought those cakes. And it's also being flexible and evolving with the situation, and not just giving up on communities when something doesn't work immediately. And being with communities for the long haul, not just coming in, trying to fix something, and then saying, oh, there's something really important to be done elsewhere, or we want you to do this. A lot of donor organizations have that approach where they come in with their agenda and they want this or that done, but don't really engage deeply with the beneficiary communities. Mm-hmm. So I think in closing, what I would say is that as a collective of faith-based organizations and faith communities, we need to really be clear about putting our faith into practice in the form, first and foremost, of having hope. of not seeing the situation that we live in the world as being hopeless, and people being hopeless, or people being beyond saving or beyond helping. We need to have faith in our God and faith in the people that God created and put into our lives. And then we need to invest the time, effort, energy, skills, resources to address root causes and structural aspects of inequality, not just assuage or satisfy our conscience by making donations and feeding people only. It really needs to be a balance between that and addressing structural causes of inequality. Not just, and again, the last thing I'm going to say is not only in small communities and within countries, but inequality among countries, because we're living in a global community, a global village. We brothers and sisters across borders. So our family is huge, and we don't want any of our brothers and sisters to go home hungry or sleep on a hungry stomach. And we don't want to just feed them for one night. We want to see all of our brothers and sisters happy, able to play in the playground, and able to put their skills to use in the best way possible, and to be respected with the same kind of dignity as everybody else. So I think I will close on that.
Yeah, that were really really inspiring words. And let me just summarize that we shouldn't lose hope, that we should stay creative about our possibilities and opportunities, that we should meaningfully participate and put efforts into addressing structural inequalities in the system, as well as between different communities or countries across borders, and to have faith in each other that we can support each other and yes, bring food to the table for others as well.
Yes.
Thank you very much again, and thank you everyone for watching. You are able to see all the videos on our project page, which was posted in the chat. And if you have 1 minute, please also fill the evaluation form so we know how to support, how to provide relevant content for you in the future. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms.
Thank you very much. Thank you too. Thank you very much.
Good night. Have a nice day.
You too.